Hello and welcome to my channel, Rhino here. Today I've got a fun one for you. I'm going to take a look at some data that was put together by at least two creationists. It may surprise you to learn that this data was peer-reviewed and published, in a reputable open-access data publication that's affiliated with Nature, no less. So let's see how creationism looks when you examine it next to data that was collected and published by creationists. And yes, I did borrow the title of the video from Ra. He covered several areas of science that disprove Noah's flood in several different ways, and while this will be a largely geology-based video, I don't believe that Aaron took the approach of using nothing but data from a creationist source in his geology videos. So let's go!
Now first I want to tell you something about a basin. A basin is something like a hollow that can hold water. That's a basin. So here's a kid sitting in a basin.
So far, so good.
Now, if you have a continent has basins, and a continent has areas where water flows in a particular direction towards the ocean.
I mean, your map there wasn't the most accurate, at least if the arrows are supposed to be pointing toward a basin. It's hard for sure to tell without a key telling us what the various colors mean. Here's a better map. Zooming in on North America, we see two basins, neither of which conforms to the shape or location of the basins on the map that you're showing. I know this seems like I'm being overly pedantic, but if you're going to be giving a presentation showing evidence that the world was submerged underwater, it would be best to at least start out accurately. But yeah, water generally flows towards the ocean. I can agree with that.
So in the United States of America, for example, there are these basins, and the water will flow from all the directions into the basins.
Now hold on there, Sparky. Are you telling me that there are no rivers in that huge swath of the middle of the United States that flow toward the ocean? Because I would just like to point out that the primary river on the second largest drainage system in North America, that is the Mississippi watershed, I mean, your map is almost the exact shape of the Mississippi watershed. Hang on, are you conflating a drainage basin with an endorheic basin? Okay, you're starting to confuse me. You made it sound like when you said basin, you were meaning a low point that collects all the water, kind of like the basin on the left of your little map, where the water flows inland and has nowhere to go. But then you point to the Mississippi watershed and call it a basin. Again, this is a fairly small point, but it would create a lot less confusion if you'd just be clear and concise with your terms.
Plus, there will be flow directions out towards the ocean. And that is a typical modern scenario. So, if we have a look at the general appearance today, here on the one side, the water will be flowing, generally speaking, towards the coast. There will be basins in the center, basins where water flows from all directions into the basins, and then you'll have flow directions to the oceans, etc. on the other sides. And then you can have, between all of them, you can have rivers flowing towards the oceans. That's a typical modern world. And that's what any world should have looked like if the conditions were roughly similar in the past. Is that correct?
Sort of. I mean, if the conditions were similar, we would expect similar results. But depending on how far back you go, the conditions were not similar. Unless you're just talking about the fact that water flows downhill to collect in the lowest spots, but somehow I don't think you're going to try and disprove that.
Okay. Do we have that? The answer is no.
Okay, so now I need to know what the that is that you're talking about when you asked if we would have that. I mean, if you go back in time, then of course the water flow patterns will change as the land changes. It doesn't take a PhD in geology to explain that the water goes downhill, and if something gets in its way, it will take the path of least resistance. And as time goes on, the landscape changes, and so will the path of the water. So if your thing that should have been the same is the path of the water, then I would have to vehemently disagree. It all depends on the shape of the land.
If we go to the Paleozoic, that's at the bottom, the lowest layer.
I beg to differ. The Paleozoic, which covers a period of time spanning almost 300 million years, was the second era of the Earth. The first era was the Precambrian, which lasted about 4 billion years. There are plenty of rock layers from the Precambrian. In fact, if you go back to the geologic map I showed before, you'll see several areas that are known as shields. These are elevated areas of geologic stability with large amounts of exposed Precambrian rock. The oldest rocks known are found in Jack Hills, Australia, where we have found 4.4 billion year old zircon. Of course, you didn't say oldest layer, you said lowest layer. There seems to be this misconception among creationists that the oldest layers are the ones that are further down. And while that is generally true-ish, the local geology does need to be taken into account. So maybe I could give you this one since a lot of Precambrian rock is actually quite elevated, but nah, we all know you meant oldest, so no pity points for you.
We find this very interesting phenomenon. Instead of having basins, there are none. From all the measurements that have been made, it appears that the water flowed in this direction.
I was very curious to know what measurements you were talking about, so I looked into it. It wasn't easy, but I found the source of that image was from a presentation by Ariel A. Roth, where he talks about the direction of sediment deposit. On his version of the picture, there is a credit at the bottom saying it was courtesy of Arthur Chadwick. So when I searched for Arthur Chadwick, I found what I think was the original paper that this was published in, though I hesitate to call it that, as it's just a couple of paragraphs hosted on a very poorly designed website, though it's possible that it was published earlier as the website references graphics that just aren't there, probably the map that you showed. But after reading the paper, which I can't confirm was actually peer-reviewed or published, I see that Chadwick, who also happens to be a young Earth creationist, did indeed find that paleocurrents from the Paleozoic era tend to go from east to west. Interestingly enough, Chadwick is one of those creationist scientists who actually does publish in peer-reviewed publications, but somehow all of his evidence for a global flood or a young age of the Earth seem to end up as self-published web articles. Funny that. If it were a conspiracy, you'd think that journals wouldn't publish him at all in order to withhold credibility. But once again, I must point out that it seems like when you do good work, your work can be published, regardless of what your personal views are. Also, he seems to have continued his paleocurrent work, as in 2015 he published his dataset of paleocurrent directions in Nature's Scientific Data Journal. I was curious, so I looked at the data. Now, what I am gathering from your video so far is that you seem to be making the argument that a massive flood pushed all the sediment in the same general direction over the entire continent, and so this is therefore evidence of a global flood, which means that for the same time period, all the continents should show similar patterns. So going into Chadwick's own database of paleocurrent directions, I shall look at Europe for the Paleozoic era, which includes everything from the Permian at the most recent to the Cambrian at the most ancient. Column O was the direction of the current in this dataset, with 0 or 360 being north, and the numbers going around like the degrees of a compass. So if your flood model is correct, then for the whole Paleozoic era, the paleocurrent should be flowing in the same general direction for most, if not all, of Europe. So out of 352 data points from that time period in Europe, 112 of them were in a direction between north and east, 78 were between east and south, 99 were between south and west, and 63 were between west and north. I'm no statistician, I can assure you, but that looks fairly evenly spaced out to me. I find it interesting actually that the two most common directions in the categories are opposite one another, which would be a hard trick to pull off indeed during a massive worldwide flood. I also find it interesting that his publication that leads people to speculate about the global flood is the one that is self-published online and looks specifically at North America, but as soon as you find his publication in an actual reputable journal, suddenly the data is worldwide and isn't quite as specific about direction as his first publication would have you believe. So I looked at his recent data for North America, and guess what? I did see a trend. About 35% of paleocurrents were flowing somewhere between south and west. This was the largest group by far, but that still leaves 65% of the paleocurrents that are flowing in the wrong direction for this to have happened all in one large flooding event. I wonder why the majority of the data points which flow in the wrong directions were left off of that cute little map that you showed. And remember, this is Chadwick's own data. Chadwick, the young Earth creationist. Chadwick, who is the same brand of young Earth creationist as Walter Veith here, namely Seventh-day Adventist.
In other words, generally speaking, from the one side here, from the east coast, generally to the southwest, right across the continent. If you go to the next layer, the Mesozoic, what do you find? The total reverse. Suddenly, things are going in the opposite direction.
Well, maybe you're working with old data, but no, that's not what Chadwick's current data suggests. Out of 5,898 data points, only 1,483 were headed in a northeastern direction. In fact, south and west, which was the most common direction for Paleozoic paleocurrent, were still the most common directions in the Mesozoic, but they are more evenly spaced out among the different directions.
If you look at the somewhat higher layers, the tertiary, we seem to find somewhat different patterns, some going this way, some going that way, some going this way. So there seems to be some form of restoration taking place?
Restoration? As if these waterways are meant to flow in a certain direction and needed time to heal after the flood? Is that what you're getting to? Because that's just plain wrong. The continents were completely different in the Precambrian. The continents didn't even start to look like they do today until about 175 million years ago when Pangaea started to split. So a restoration would lead to continents that look more like this. And naturally, if the continents are shaped completely differently, the water will drain off said continents in a completely different manner than what it does today. So you're not seeing a restoration in the data, you're seeing the drainage system slowly developing into what we know today. Why do creationists always want to put end goals on natural processes? First they claim that evolution had people in mind when it started, now the very Earth had the Mississippi drainage system planned out right from the beginning.
So what do we find? Summary. Precambrian. North America paleocurrents are variable across the craton, show no distinctive continent-wide pattern. So right down at the bottom, it's the same as what you would expect today. So maybe the Precambrian was once the surface of the Earth. That's consistent. The Paleozoic, suddenly you show patterns that are continent-wide and typically flow towards the west and southwest across the continent.
Only if you ignore 65% of the data.
That's impossible.
It's not impossible. I used to bullseye womp rats in my T-16 back home. They're not much bigger than 2 meters.
I don't think it's impossible. I mean, it's rather unlikely in my humble non-geologist opinion, but water just flows downhill. If the East Coast was highly elevated and the West Coast fairly low, you would expect water to flow from east to west. That's actually a pretty accurate description of how the Mississippi drainage system works. Most of the rivers in the US end up in that particular drainage system, which generally flows from north to south.
You cannot have water flowing from one side of the United States all the way across to the other side, and Canada and everything else.
Why not? The Mississippi drainage system starts in southern Canada, in Saskatchewan and Alberta to be specific, and flows all the way across the United States until it reaches the southern coast in the Gulf of Mexico. Are you suggesting that this is impossible? 41% of the United States rivers drain through the Mississippi system, so that's 41% of US rivers flow in a general north to south direction. Compare that to the 35% of the data points flowing from east to west in the Paleozoic era, as evidenced by actual scientific data from a creationist source, and suddenly the Paleozoic east to west trend seems much less impressive.
And then in the next time, all the way in the opposite direction. In the Mesozoic, exactly the opposite. It goes from the west to the east.
Incorrect. Again, I would like to point out that the peer-reviewed data that was published in a reputable scientific journal that I am getting my information from was from a creationist author. At least 2 creationist authors, in fact. I couldn't find any information on the third author, and I don't want to sully a future scientist's reputation by assuming that she's a creationist when she very well might not be. But again, I don't think you had access to the same dataset as I do when you gave this talk, so I can't be sure what the data from the original paper suggested. It is possible that there wasn't enough data at that time, and as such these patterns looked like they were there. But even if that was the case, I don't have to limit myself to your data. I know that the new data shows you to be incorrect. The Mesozoic did not have opposite flow patterns from the Paleozoic. If anything, it showed a similar pattern, but slightly more evenly distributed.
And then in the Cenozoic, there seems to be some continued pattern of the Cretaceous, Paleozoic, but become variable, so they start becoming normal again.
You have yet to demonstrate that they were ever not normal, even if everything you said up to this point had been true. I mean, aside from the assertion that such a pattern is impossible, but you didn't back that assertion up with any evidence.
So what happened here in the Paleozoic and Mesozoic is inexplicable. These trends are not expected in the standard model of geology. The trends reveal processes that were much larger than anything that you see today, and they are consistent with a global flood.
I'd like to see your source for that. Even the original paper that was self-published on his website didn't go so far as to say it was consistent with a global flood.
Let's go to South America. What would you expect in the Precambrian and in the Paleozoic? Precambrian, you have basins, you have all these strange things, not many measurements around.
Well, I can't fault you there. There are only 77 data points even in the new set. Hardly enough to draw any conclusions from.
If you go a little bit higher, suddenly, boom! The water flowed right across the continent. Can it do that today?
Today, most of South America's rivers flow roughly east, and again, this might be you having old data, but while most of the paleocurrents from this era were directed to the western side of the compass, 31% were pointing east. That's not far off from the 35% of currents that were headed west in North America that caused you to say that all of them were headed west. Talk about the ever-shifting goalposts of creationism.
Now, what happens here today? What's there? A huge mountain range. There's no way that the water can flow from one side right across to the other side.
I know you're a young Earth creationist, and as such, this will be rather hard for you to grasp, but when you accept the fact that the Earth is billions of years old, this brings with it such data-explaining phenomena as plate tectonics, where mountain ranges don't have to have always existed. But even if I grant you the mountains, which definitely would not have been around hundreds of millions of years ago, let me point out that 56% of the data from the Paleozoic in South America is from sample areas of 1 square kilometer or less. And judging by how all of the area data are rounded off to nice even numbers, I would be willing to bet that the majority of the 1 square kilometer measurements are actually much smaller than 1. Why is this important? Because when measuring the direction of a flow of a river, generally you would have to take the direction as a whole. So when I mentioned the Mississippi flowing from north to south, that's the general direction of the whole water system, but the Mississippi itself is very curvaceous. There are several areas where it flows temporarily from south to north. So even if the mountains were still there, they could very well have been many places where the water would have been temporarily flowing toward the mountains, and without measuring the larger area, we don't really know for sure that this wasn't the case. Also, there is another column in the data, the environment column. This is a very important column for this data because if you're trying to say that the flow directions are indicating a worldwide flood, you would expect that the majority of the data would be from a marine environment. Well, looking at just South America, there were 550 data points from the Paleozoic era. Well, 43% of the data points were indeed from marine environments, so far so good. But then 29% of the data are from lacustrine, alluvial, and subaerial aeolian deposits. Lacustrine deposits are from lake bottoms. I may be wrong, but I don't think it's very easy to find inland lakes during a worldwide flood that covers all land. Alluvial deposits are land-based sediment deposits from things like rock slides or mudslides. Again, a hard thing to find during a flood that covers all the land. And then subaerial aeolian deposits are land-based surface sediment shaped by the wind. And all this is assuming that a global flood would be able to cause river and river delta sediment, which make up another 28% of the data. I don't know enough about geology to say for sure that it wouldn't, but something tells me that a catastrophic flood that covered the whole Earth in just 40 days would be so violent that there wouldn't be time for nice orderly rivers and deltas to form before being blasted away by a much more massive body of water crashing through. So, including the river and delta deposits, that's 57% of all the paleocurrent flow data for this time period in South America being from environments that just wouldn't exist during a global flood.
Wow!
Wow indeed. It really is amazing that when creationists publish peer-reviewed datasets, these datasets fly in the face of young Earth creationism.
And in the Mesozoic, exactly in the opposite direction. Woof! Is this possible? No.
Okay, one more round of data counting. So, looks here like 55% of the flows were in a generally eastern direction, but then that means that 45% of the flows were in a generally western direction. So, once again, the data does not support your assertion.
Only with a universal flood would this be possible.
Not true, but even if I grant you that, it's not what we see from the data, so your point is irrelevant.
If you put all the continents together, you have a universal pattern.
Wait. You're throwing all the continents together in the last 30 seconds of the video? It's a bit late to be bringing that up. Does that mean you accept continental drift, or do you think that the flood caused the continents to have one massive migration and it doesn't happen anymore? Why would you put the continents together? Is it just a visual aid to show the direction of the currents, which we've already determined you got wrong? And for that matter, why would the floodwaters have reversed when the flood receded? How did the water leave the planet? Did the fountains of the deep open up like a big plug being pulled from a bathtub, so all the water had to flow in one direction toward it? If the water had come out of the fountains of the deep originally and flowed in one direction with such ferocity as to cause all of the paleocurrent data to show it flowing in one direction, then would its momentum not cause it to continue flowing in that same direction when the fountains of the deep plug was pulled? So why would the flow reverse as the flood receded? A body of water that large would have a ridiculous amount of momentum. I think getting it to reverse would have taken some massive divine intervention, and what would be the point of that? All of these questions are assuming that you are correct about the data, so if I grant you every point you have just made, it raises more questions than it answers. But, as I feel I demonstrated, you are completely incorrect about these continental flow patterns, so there's really no need to answer any of these questions. You just need to figure out what it means that the updated dataset demonstrates the fact that you are incorrect. That's all for today. At this point, I would like to mention that geology is not an area of science that I am overly familiar with, so if I made any glaring errors, feel free to point them out and I'll make sure to pin a comment with any corrections. Thanks for watching, remember to follow me on Twitter and Facebook, and support me on Patreon. See you next time!